with Brandi. Brandi, you know, we're talking a little bit about, I just shared some of the kind of historical harms around media that are media specific. And I want to ask you, what are some of the most glaring examples of modern and historical media harms that you know of?
Yes, and thanks again, everybody. So, I mean, I want to pull it back a little bit and just reflect on the fact that it's interesting that we're in this national and global discourse about misinformation and disinformation, because as has already been pointed out in the chat, we have long seen media, mainstream media in certain ways as the architects of fake news about our communities. And often the media has served as a tool of hegemony, agents of the status quo, framers of the harms and impacts in the ways that facilitate war globally and at home against marginalized and colonialized communities. And so it's often interesting because, like, no one loves the media more than the media loves themselves. But even in that question of who are we talking about when we're talking about the media, the dominant understanding of that is often rooted in class, tied to geography, ethnicity, cultural language, gender, medium, among other things. Oftentimes when we look at folk music or hip hop or other forms of media, music, it is media that is sharing what is immediately happening in our communities, often giving warning signs and a number of other things, but those aren't considered legitimate forms of media. So for me, as I thought about this question, I think I would break it out into 6 layers of harm. So one would be anti-Black myth making. And, you know, that's true anti, you know, insert marginalized class, but like I'm gonna focus on Black communities. And so the anti-Black myth making that comes from things like the false myth of the crack baby that then made its way into policy making, the welfare queen. Willie Horton was a notable example from the 90s of use of this like super predator trope that we've seen continue to haunt us. We've also seen like use of mugshots and different things in a way that mirrors what we just discussed around like slave ads in overuse of Black and brown communities mugshots in our life, even in our deaths. You know, as perpetuators of a harm to the white establishment. Second would be deliberate misrepresentation of events and distortions of events. Some of the ways in which we've seen this come into play is like oftentimes when we talk about harms that go in that have happened in our communities historically, when you're talking about Tulsa and these other places in which white mobs have gone into Black communities, communities of color, and destroyed land and taken lives. Those are often framed as like a riot, as if that's somehow a mutual fight, as opposed to a massacre, or what those things actually are. The reporting of death is often done in lumps so that you can't tell how many like Black lives lost versus white lives, which again creates this sort of distortion of facts. And then in recently, this kind of false equivalency that we see, like the histrionic brushstrokes that property damage is painted as in a way that's meant to like seat that unequal plank as the loss of Black lives. That sort of distortion of things in a way that, again, perpetuates harm to our communities. Third, elite white male thought framed as default logic without question. And so some of the ways in which we've seen that play out is, you know, Cotton's op-ed in New York Times was the most recent example. An op-ed factually inaccurate, meant to cultivate harm, run without the editor so much as even looking at it to do a fact check. In the early days of Wired, Rush Limbaugh, Newt Gingrich, and Wired is one of the foremost publications that informed Silicon Valley. They would have their views run critically unedited with all sorts of frameworks that then created this sort of bricks of what we see in Silicon Valley. I'd also say the chronic underreporting of trauma. Again, like in the early days of COVID-19, one of the things that happened was like online, we saw a lot of false narratives and memes that said that Black people were not susceptible to coronavirus. And as that was happening, the early deaths in the US were actually Black people. that was underreported. They were reported without race. There were a lot of ways in which media shortcomings combined with Silicon Valley shortcomings directly contributed to this rise of disproportionate Black death. And then finally, I'll say we haven't even fully gotten into the issues of just like underpaying, underhiring, first fired, the ways in which we're locked out of decision-making access within media. So that very tangible financial and information loss that we've seen would be the last thing.
Would hit. What I would say is, if we're talking about overt things, well, when there's a crime and the Black victim of the crime is criticized by the media and the white perpetrators of the crime are humanized, well, all right, that tells you whose life. My thing is about what media tell you in their language, in their choices, right? It tells you whose life is valuable, whose life is not valuable, who should be believed when they speak, and who should not be believed, whose death is to be mourned, and whose death is not to be mourned. But I want to go another way and also we're talking about how do media harm? Why do we need reparations from media? Well, when media, corporate media talk about Africa as if it's one country, right? Because we don't deserve differentiation. We don't deserve that. We're just Black folks, and that's that. And that's the dishonoring. That's racism, right? That's racism, where it's not about, hey, this guy, they called him a thug. We need to interrogate everything about the language of media and find the racism where it's at. And that's one of those places. So Tom Brokaw, a lot of folks listening, born after he was, don't even know who I'm talking about. But Tom Brokaw is like this NBC guy, kind of, avuncular. He talks about when the United States is invading Iraq, he says, we need to be careful because in a week we're going to own that country. That's racism. That's racism. We need to identify that where it's at. When folks say this is a country where people don't look like us, and so we get to be in charge of them, that's also racism. So when I think about it, I think about it's not just when they call it out, when they say it, right? It's about the assumption environment that corporate media exist in. And it's about what I would say the lens of pathology in which Black people in news media, and especially local news media, if they're not athletes or entertainers, then just look at where they show up in the news. And it's going to be crime or drugs or government aid, in other words, drains on society. So that has everything to do with where media are comfortable pointing their cameras, where they feel like they can demand a perp walk, right? From who they decide they can describe as crimes as coming from, and who they don't think they can do that. So the effects of media racism on public opinion, for example, to take one example on crime, that's manifest. We know that. That's documented. We understand that the way that media cover crime influences people's understanding of who's going to be a victim of crime, is who's going to be a perpetrator of crime. And we understand that those opinions are wrong. They don't match up to reality. They don't match up to reality. What they match up to is racism, right? So it's not hard to document and demonstrate the way that corporate media underscore and implement, you know, a racist understanding of society. We know that. We know that. We have a documentation of that. What we don't have is an understanding of how we need to change that. How we
Well, I'm going to take a step back a little bit and talk, when we keep talking about media as a system, we gave some really powerful examples of how it shapes narrative, but I want us to take a step back and just understand what narrative is and what we're talking about, just a little bit before I get to my sort of take on it. People with a particular perception of the world based on their values, their education, and their lived experiences have the power to create narratives. Those narratives help shape how other people perceive the world. So what we're doing is, one, we're in framing this need for repair, is we're telling folks who are usually in the position of power, which are white men, that they indeed help shape people's perception of the world. And by telling them that, we're saying, therefore you have a responsibility, right? And that means you can then be held accountable, okay? And one of the key things, we talk about media a lot, but I think the focus here for us is mass media, and a cornerstone of that mass media is news media. It's one of the reasons why one of the first laws passed in this country, you know, as a new set of federal states, was to implement the national mailing system, right? They wanted to be able to get information. They wanted to get newspapers out and get information to the populace. Well, why is that such an important thing to do? Why does a new nation need that kind of infrastructure at the founding of the nation? It's because they understood that they needed to help, they needed propaganda to shape people's understanding of the world, right? So the second part is control. So news media is a part of a system of control. And what we're saying is we're holding them accountable by saying, not only are you responsible, but you are part of this white supremacist control. Also, we're saying that you have a particular ideology, okay? Like a lot of times we see one of the most powerful concepts that have been levied against marginalized folks in this long argument we've been having to hold media accountable for how they shape culture is the concept of objectivity, okay? That we're news people, our job is to be objective. Well, if you think that your white male point of view is the default point of view, if you believe that to be objective, that means you believe that everyone else's experience is naturally subjective. And therefore, this concept of objectivity has been leveraged against marginalized folks as we've been fighting for our space in this ecosystem. So I want to just leverage that too, is to say, what they're saying to us is their ideology is the ideology without even recognizing that they're doing that, right? So I wanted to just make that point. And when we talk about the white supremacist structure, I want us to really keep thinking about it as an ideology. It is, they believe that the world should be like this, and therefore they made the world in the image that they believe it to be, right? So they leverage their imagination to build a system of control so that they can be on top. And therefore, to do that, you have to control the images that help shape people's imaginations to do so. So that, I wanted to just frame it that way, because we have to understand that white supremacist culture is a very creative and imaginative one, and it's very robust, it's very brilliantly made, and they've had time and resources to shape these systems, okay? So that's sort of like, I wanted to frame it that way. We also have the power to create narrative. We also have the power to build collective power. And for us, I think the key thing with reparations is for us to define it for ourselves, first of all, to say, here is what we want. And I really loved how you all started, you all gave us several instances of how we win. So, because so frequently we're having these conversations, we're defining the problem and we're not defining like the terms of engagement to say, here's how we gonna say we gonna win, right? what stood out to me was an abundance of media that exists. The idea that abundance is a central value in us knowing when we win. Okay, so I think that's a really first thing in reparations for us to say a plurality of media exists. The other thing I want to lift up was from, because I hope y'all were able to catch the opening plenary with Adrienne Murray Brown, Autumn Brown, and Channing Nicholas, because they give us so much to work with. But one of the frameworks that Adrienne lifted up was there's a reason we were meant to orient towards Indigenous leadership. And to me, what that means many things. But one of the things that means is, one, we have access to ancestral memory, okay? Because to imagine is to do that, is to access stored memory, all right? And so within us, within our indigeneity as oppressed peoples, we have access to that ancestral memory. It is part of imagination and image making. So I wanted to sort of lift that up as a key framework for repair. The last thing I want to lift up is the idea of Indigenous leadership is one that is collective. That is who we've been. We have lived in collective since the beginning of time, right? And so, and by we, I'm talking about folks who are currently oppressed. And so we have a lot to learn from folks who are Indigenous to this land that we live in, for Black folks that we're fighting for, in terms of how we leverage our collectivity in our imagination. You all obviously are modeling this right now to say, hey, listen, we're gonna vision this thing together. We are accessing it right now. But I think for reparations, we need to be clear that it is a collective endeavor, and therefore all the solutions that we should uplift come from localized collective endeavors. There are communities already engaged in media reparations. They're just engaged in a part where they're just building what they want to see. They're building what they need. And that to me is a really critical part of reparations. It's not just about what we can get when we hold other people accountable. It's also how we harness our collective power to build what we need and what we know to be true. I'll pass it to Brandi.
I mean, amen. Thank you for that.